Hello, it's me, Ariza Gaming, and welcome back to another episode of Sandbox Showcase, the series where I talk about problems in Oxygen Not Included and how to solve them easily and effectively. So today we're doing an update to the previous video that we did on automated lumb ranching with the prehistoric planet pack, because there have been two major updates in the November quality of life update relating to lumbs. And if you haven't watched that previous video, please do watch it. Everything will make more sense, I promise. But essentially, we developed a ranch setup where we're using automation and doors to make sure that we can get lumbs in ranches with the Lura Plants growing, providing all of our food for us, providing a load of peat, and making sure that the duplicants can spend their time grooming instead of shuffling lumbs around everywhere. And this system works of arbitrary size. You can have as many of these ranches stacked on top of each other as possible, and the lumbs will all drop down the chute and get into the rooms. But the two changes I want to talk about today. First of all, there is a new lumb variant called the Blum Lumb, and instead of producing peat, this guy produces 2/3 of the mass as algae instead. So this means that we can actually get water going into the plants turned directly into algae, and it's a lot of algae. It's way more water efficient to use Blum Lumbs than to use oxyferns or electrolyzers, for instance, in terms of the amount of oxygen we're getting per unit water. But there's another thing that's really good about algae. It's a solid. You can just put it in the oxygen diffuser and move oxygen around your base really easily. You can put it in rockets. It's very easy to transport via conveyor rails compared to using gas pumps for oxygen, which are very power inefficient for the amount of gas they move. Obviously, if you need Atmos suits running, you need a gas pump anyways to get it in the pipes. But if you don't, the algae from Blum Lumbs is generally going to be a lot more convenient. And the differences with Blum Lumbs are fairly straightforward. You get Blum Lumb eggs from having lumbs in carbon dioxide. So all we need to do to actually modify our original setup is just replace these airflow tiles with regular tiles. Carbon dioxide will build up in these areas, and then the egg chance of Blum Lumbs will increase over time, and eventually you'll end up with a load of Blum Lumbs, and you can start getting algae instead of peat. So that's fairly straightforward, and we're not going to dwell on that difference too much. And we'll talk more about the maths later, because now that you have an option to produce algae and oxygen from these critters instead of peat, we can actually figure out the optimal ratio of regular lumbs to Blum Lumbs for your colony to look after a certain amount of duplicants with the food from the lumbs and the blums, and then the algae from the blums specifically. So we'll talk more about that later. But the second change I want to talk about is the critter size space requirements for ranches. In the previous video, I decided not to go with using Mimikas to pollinate our plants, even though it's really good, because the lumbs thought the Mimikas was worth 16 tiles of ranch space, when in actuality, a lumb takes up 16 tiles, but a Mimica only takes up 8 tiles of space. So if you were going to have Mimikas in a lumb ranch before November, it was going to be very space inefficient to have all those things together, and you wouldn't know what to do with all the space. But now we can fit them in the same ranch size effectively and get more lumbs and more Mimikas pollinating in the same room. So we produced a new ranch layout that is actually going to let you have this flying critter in our dropper setup. And that's kind of weird, isn't it? Because the flying critter should, in theory, be able to fly through all of these rooms and mess with the critter sensors and prevent it from actually functioning properly in terms of knowing when to drop lumbs. Maybe a Mimica's going to fly into the other room, and then it's going to think the room's empty and you're going to drop a lumb into it by accident. But we have actually solved this problem. And because these vines take absolutely ages to grow, we've solved it in advance. We're not building everything live today. I've already built everything. We have a left-handed version and a right-handed version of the build. And there are a couple of differences just because the lumbs are 2x2 critters and they move in funny ways. We'll talk about the right-handed build a bit later, but we're going to start with the left-handed build. And in this case, because we're just doing regular lumbs, what we've done is we put airflow tiles all along the bottom to make sure it doesn't fill up with any carbon dioxide in the areas where the lumbs are hanging out. And this should mean that we get mostly lumb eggs. There's a couple of key differences in ranch layout compared to before, and we'll go through all the overlays in a minute as well. But essentially, to allow the Mimikas to coexist with the lumbs, we have added a room over here, or we've added a section over here where we've got the Mimica buds growing. They could grow, and then the Mimikas can fly freely through the room and pollinate all of the Ovagro vines or whatever plants you have in here. But importantly, we actually have a column of liquids that is going to prevent the Mimikas from flying through it and getting into the dropper mechanism. So this way we can make sure that the critter sensors don't fluctuate based on Mimikas going between ranches in our dropper column, which is really good for us. And what we've actually done is we've used Visco Gel for the video. Now, if you've watched my Twitch runs, you know you can just stack low mass blobs of liquids. You need 4 different liquids in this case to get it to work, but you can do it. Even without Visco Gel. But the thing is, you can actually get Visco Gel reasonably early on Relica, where you find all of these critters, because you get it as part of the space point of interest from blowing up Demolior. One of the fields has isosap as a debris that you can collect with your rocket. And this means you can make Visco Gel much earlier than you normally would, because you don't have to go to the asteroid with the angry tree. So, I think using Visco Gel for this is pretty good, because it just means you can conveniently get this liquid column. Visco Gel stacks at 100 kilograms per tile, and it will just keep the Mimikas out, and the Lumbs can still pass through it. Now, how, pray tell, do you expect the Lumbs to pass through a liquid column? Well, the answer is actually quite simple. I'm going to remove, let's say I'm going to remove the Lumb from down here for now. So what this will do, this buffer gate will activate, so you can see it started counting down here. And then once that's counted down, the room is going to recognize that it's empty, and then the Lumb is going to get dropped in. We set this to a 40-second buffer because the Mimikas and the Lumbs like to fly into the doors and occasionally be outside the room. But this adds plenty of buffer to prevent that from messing with the critter sensors. And also, eventually, the Mimikas actually synchronize dying with when the Mimika bud produces a new Mimika. Each Mimika bud grows in 5 cycles and can't be pollinated by a Mimika, and each Mimika critter dies in 5 cycles. So eventually, as one dies, a new one will be birthed, and there's a few seconds of delay, but it's enough that it can also be captured by this buffer gate. So this helps, increasing the buffer on the automation to 40 seconds really helps with that. But yeah, here's the automation layout for our dropper ranch. It's not that different from previous. We've had to move some wires around just to account for different building positions, and I'll talk more about that in a bit when we talk about the maths of Blum-To-Lumb ratios. But essentially, the automation is more or less the same. It's just rearranged very slightly. And that's also the same for the right-orientated build, as you can see over here. We've still got the critter sensor in the critter drowner set to below 1 critters. We've got one of these critter sensors set to below 1 critters, one set to above, to make sure we have 1 critter at a time in the dropper. And then we have these critter sensors. I'll talk more about those in a minute. But essentially, our Lumb will wander into this room. The room will detect that there's a Lumb in it, and then it will close this door. And then this filter gate will activate 5 seconds later, and it will open this door. And then this will allow the Lumb to wander into this door. Lumbs like to wander about a lot, so don't worry about the Lumb staying still for too long. And then once he wanders into this door, the game will recognize he's no longer in this room, the door will shut, and he will get pushed through this door by the door closing above him. So this column can be arbitrarily high. We have a door open in this case because this room has enough critters in it. This would also be a door that would open normally, but in this case he's just going to land on the tiles. And then you'll notice he can actually jump through the liquid. This is the exact same mechanism that we've used to make sure that the critter can be groomed and the grooming errand doesn't get interrupted by the critter leaving the room and entering the door. That doesn't happen because the Lumb is a 2x2 critter, and when he's moving down or up a row of tiles, depending on which way he's orientated, he'll just skip the tile. So in this case, he'll skip through the liquid, he'll recognize he's drowning because he's in the liquid, he'll move out, and he can't move back into the dropper. So this means we can make sure that our Lumbs can still get into the room, but the Mimikas can't leave. And that's what we're doing with this big column of Visco Gel. So I'm really happy with that. This means we can have both Mimikas and Lumbs in the same room. The other change we have to do is we have to change these critter sensors to account for the Mimikas being present, and also to account for the pollination increasing the amount of food we have access to. So ordinarily, you would want 1 Ovagro node for 2 Lumbs. Each Lumb can eat 1 vine's worth of food once it's fully grown to 12 segments. And as we explained in the previous video, we've arranged these doors like this so that the vines can grow in a space-efficient manner, while we still have room to put our auto sweepers and loaders in to get rid of the eggs and peat, etc. But with the Mimikas pollinating, the Mimikas give a 25% growth speed bonus to plants. So now one Ovagro node is actually producing enough food for 2.5 Lumbs. So what you can do is you can have 3 Lumbs in the top branch, 2 Lumbs in the bottom branch, and as you expand the column downwards of branches, you just have it be 3 Lumbs, 2 Lumbs, 3 Lumbs, 2 Lumbs, and so on and so forth. That means that this vine down here will produce extra food for 0.5 Lumbs worth. And I put some critter feeders in here just so the dupes can redistribute the food as needed to make sure that it's all balanced. You can do this with mechatronics. You can filter out the figs from the loaders once the Lumbs stomp the ground and harvest them from the plants. You can filter them out and then put them back in the feeders yourself if you have a really large setup. I haven't bothered in this case, but it's totally doable. But you want to have the critter feeder in the room just to make sure you can balance the load, because you can't have half a Lum in a room, unfortunately. And then there's the actual amount of Mimikas. Now, we have a Lura plant in this room. If you don't have a Lura plant in this room, then you could just have 3 Mimikas in here. They'd be enough to pollinate 30 plants. You'd have 24 plants, 24 vine segments. They'd get everything pollinated, and you're all good. You would always have 3 Mimikas in here, because each Mimika would die at roughly the same time as the Mimika bud produces a new Mimika. What we've actually done is we've added a Lura plant, because Lura plants eat flying critters and turn them into amber, which can then be turned into resin and plastic. This is a great source of plastic because each Mimica bud only consumes 10 kilograms per cycle of dirt. We can turn that into a lot of plastic, and we'll talk more about Lura plants and plastic production in a separate video later on. It'll probably be the next video, actually. But essentially, we can grow an extra Mimica in here and just have the Lura plant eat an extra Mimica and get some nice plastic production that way. So what will end up happening is this Lura plant, because it's pollinated, normally they grow in 12 cycles, but because it's pollinated, it'll grow in 9.6 cycles. This means it will eat about half a Mimica's bud's worth of Mimikas. So sometimes we'll have 3 Mimikas in this room, sometimes we'll have 4. 3 is enough to pollinate everything, so that's fine. And because the room is 80 tiles in size, we've taken some tiles out up here, but we can do that consistently for any room. Once you get further down into the column, you can just do these 3 tiles in each room. You can get rid of these 3, and it's absolutely fine. You can always end up with 80 tiles in these rooms, and that's enough for 3 Lumbs and 4 Mimikas. So even with the Lura plant eating them occasionally, if it doesn't eat it at that specific moment, you're still going to have room for everything. And because Lumbs have long lifespans, we've set this to above 5. In this case, we've still got 4 Mimikas hanging around because this Lura plant is just finishing digesting the previous Mimica. But essentially, if we put a Lum up here, this Lum isn't going to get dropped right away because it still thinks this room is full. But as soon as this Mimica dies, or as soon as the Mimica gets eaten by the Lura plant, then the room will realize it's full again. And Lums live for so long that they live for 200 cycles. They live for so long, the lifespan of a Mimica is pretty insignificant compared to the lifespan of a Lum. So this doesn't make a huge overall difference the amount of productivity you're going to get out of your Lums. So I think it's an acceptable trade-off to have a Lura plant in the room, have the Mimica count fluctuate, but have access to that extra plastic just from keeping this guy up and running. And the reality is, if you have a lot of Lums being ranched, you can fit a lot of Lura plants in your column and get a lot of plastic production. And we've done this on Twitch in our previous Prehistoric Planet Pack run and gotten a lot of plastic out of this. This has been the primary thing we've done for plastic, and it's worked really well. So yeah, I think that's pretty much explaining all of the changes down here. The automation has changed a little bit, but not really. The mechatronics has changed a little bit, but not really. We're still just feeding everything with water pipes. We're just feeding these Ovagro vines with water pipes. Nothing too complicated there. And the power is all just connected together via the same wire. Let's actually explain the top room now, and then we'll start getting into some of the maths. So I changed this dropper room slightly to make it a little bit bigger, just so we can fit a kiln in the room, as well as all the critter sensors. It looks a little bit different between the two setups. Here, on the left-orientated design, we've got a 3x3, and on this right-orientated design, we've got a 2x3, but it's still fine. Essentially, what I wanted to make sure is that at the top of our column, we have facilities to make sure we can process all the peat that comes from the lumbs. So we have the kiln for refined carbon production, we have a smoker for tough meat into tender brisket production, and then we have the peat generators for actually producing power, as well as polluted water and carbon dioxide from the peat. We'll talk more about ratios in a bit, but again, just to have the lumbs actually stay as lumbs and not produce Blum Lumb eggs, we've got airflow tiles all through here to make sure all the carbon dioxide just falls through the floor. But if we go over to this side, we filled all those tiles in. The build is very similar in terms of overall arrangement, but these rooms naturally form a carbon dioxide pit, especially with the visco gel column here and then sealing off this door here. The carbon dioxide builds up in here pretty well, especially from the smoker and the peat burner as well. These both produce carbon dioxide, so you'll eventually end up with a fair bit of carbon dioxide in here. And then these guys will just, as I say, they will produce vast majority of their eggs as Blum Lumb eggs. So very little change overall required. The critter dropper mechanism looks very slightly different. Just because of how the critters move, but the actual dropper chute doesn't change layout. This is symmetrical, this is the same overall. The grooming station is on the same side. One difference is the Lura plant and the critter feeder are both on this side, because the lumb has to be standing on this tile to actually access the feeder. If you put the feeder on this tile, it won't work, because the lumb technically isn't ever standing in this tile. They're always standing on the right side. That's basically what's going on with this. But yeah, all of the settings, it's rearranged very slightly differently, but all of the settings are the exact same. One difference I have made is I've set up a little conveyor rail element sensor here with a shutoff, so that we can filter out Blum Lumb eggs and make sure they go in this ranch. Usually we would expect these guys to produce only Blum Lumb eggs, and we would expect these guys to only produce Lumb eggs. You can occasionally get some differences, but this egg chance actually updates dynamically based on whether they're in carbon dioxide or not. So more often than not, you should end up with roughly a 0% chance either way. The Blum Lumbs will occasionally have some Lumb egg chance, because they'll be standing up here and there's not as much carbon dioxide up here. So that egg chance will gradually increase in that case. So this filter ensures that we're dumping Lumb eggs over here and Blum Lumb eggs over here in the right respective columns. And that's essentially all of the updates I made to this design. I'm very happy with it overall, and we have already done a Twitch run where we used a very similar design. The main difference between this design and the one I did on Twitch is the dupes on Twitch were running through this side to get to the grooming station, and I thought that wasn't very efficient because they were getting sopping wet from walking through the liquid column, and they were having to run a long way. So I think if you're generally doing this, what you want to do is you actually want to have your grooming station on the side that's accessed, and have the visco gel be on the side that's not accessed. So what you may actually want to do, instead of having the column going down here where you have the critters dropping next to each other, you might want to have the critters dropping on opposite sides, have the Lumb Ranch here, and have the Blum Lumb Ranch over here, and then you can access these ranches via the central column. You could do that as well. But that's the main change I made compared to the Twitch design that we did. And now to talk about some actual maths. Yes, there's more maths in this video. Because Blum Lumbs produce algae, algae is oxygen, oxygen is life. Blum Lumbs produce algae, whereas regular lumbs produce peat, and peat can be burned for power, polluted water, and carbon dioxide. Both variants produce tough meat, which can be cooked with peat in a smoker into nice food, and we use the peat for refined carbon production as well. So how do we determine the right ratio of lumbs to blums for our colony? So let's do a deep dive on this maths. So each lumb produces 200 kilograms per cycle of peat. This is enough to run up to 2 smokers simultaneously to produce 6 to 7 kilograms per cycle of refined carbon in a kiln, or to run a peat burner with 33% uptime for 160 watts of power and 40 kilograms per cycle of polluted water. A smoker consumes 6 kilograms per cycle of tough meat, while lumbs produce an egg once every 12 cycles on average, and thus about 1 kilogram per cycle of tough meat via the drowner. So for Blum-to-Lumb ratios, we can thus have 11 blums per lumb, and the one lumb will produce enough peat to run 2 smokers to process all of the tough meat from those 12 critters, while most of the product is algae. You can use 3 lumbs worth of peat to run a peat burner continuously. So if you have 8 blums to 4 lumbs, or a 2-to-1 Blum-to-Lumb ratio, then you can run both 2 smokers for all the meat and a peat burner for power. If you also have 1 lumb with a kiln, producing enough refined carbon for 333.3 kilograms per cycle of steel, you can then have it so that 6 blums and 6 lumbs, i.e. a 1-to-1 ratio of blums to lumbs, are running 2 smokers, a peat burner, and up to 666.7 kilograms per cycle of steel production. Now, lumbs eat 1,300 calories per cycle of aggro figs, and they produce 200 kilograms per cycle of peat. Blum Lumbs produce 132 kilograms per cycle of algae. This is about 2/3. If we look at the oxyfern, so we talked about oxyferns and alveolarias and other oxygen sources a lot in our previous videos. The oxyfern produces 31.3 grams per second of oxygen from 31.7 grams per second of water, which is about 100% efficiency. In contrast, Blum Lumbs without pollination will turn 75 grams per second of water going into the Ovagro node. Each Ovagro node requires 90 kilograms per cycle, or 150 grams per second. So without pollination, each Blum Lumb turns 75 grams per second of water into 220 grams per second of algae. This means, because an algae diffuser runs off of 550 grams per second of algae, 2.5 blums, i.e. the average ranch's worth, is enough to continuously run 1 oxygen diffuser at 100% uptime. So that is 200 grams per second of oxygen coming out of that, which is enough for 2 duplicants per Blum Lumb. However, if you're feeding the algae to algae terrariums instead, and we've done a previous video talking about algae terrariums as well, you can actually get up to 251.77 grams per second of net oxygen per blum. So overall, the water to oxygen efficiency increases to between 267% and 336%, depending on whether you're feeding the algae to oxygen diffusers or algae terrariums. However, if you pollinate the Ovagro vines with the Mimikas instead, you get a 25% boost again. So this means you're actually turning 60 grams per second of water into 220 grams per second of algae, and thus 200 to 251.77 grams per second of oxygen. And this increases the water efficiency of the Blum Lumb to between 333% and 420% of the amount of water you're putting in. And compared to the other oxygen producers, this is way more oxygen than anything else in the game. It's absolutely fantastic. So the long and short of it is, we don't actually need that many blums compared to lumbs in our system. So what we can do is we can make our Lumb Tower much taller than our Blum Tower and still have everything work out well in terms of ratios. So without pollination, a lumb and a peat burner with Ovagro figs converts 45 grams per second of water into 66.7 grams per second of polluted water and some carbon dioxide. So without pollination, this actually still multiplies the total amount of water that you have in your system if you're continuously using the power or even just wasting the power from the peat burner. And this is a multiplier of 1.481. If you use Mimika pollination, this actually gets multiplied by 1.25, and you end up with an overall water multiplier of 1.852, as 36 grams per second of water going into the vine is turned into 66.7 grams per second of polluted water. So that's fantastic. And then if you filter that polluted water with a water sieve, admittedly using sand filtration medium, so you need to have a source of sand and filtration medium, perhaps a saltwater geyser that you're crushing the salt into table salt with. Or perhaps you're boiling and condensing the polluted water to get the regular water back. This is enough water to completely actually sustain your Evagro nodes. You can literally just take the pump here, run it through a sieve. So literally, I'm not going to go through all the specifics of this, but you can fit one in one of these rooms down here as well if you so choose. We'll put the water sieve in here. We'll just let the cycle roll over. And then that can actually be your water source for all of this. And obviously, the peat burner is producing the power to actually run the sieve. So this is really good for us. This means that the actual food input for the Lumbs can be completely sustainable. And we're essentially getting free food, free Lumbs, free peat. It's fantastic. Considering that 1 out of 12 lumps is going to be needed to run the smokers for converting all of the tough meat. That means out of the 11 remaining critters, if we were going to recycle all of the polluted water from the peat burners, about 7.425 out of 11 critters would need to be lumps to sustain all of the Evagro vines for everyone. So this means, in this case, 3.575 out of those 11 critters can be Blums. Thus, the total ratio of Lums to Blums is 8.425 Lums to 3.575 Blums. So it's about 2.357 Lums per Blum. And this column of Lums is thus going to be much taller than this column of Blums if we're feeding everyone off of the peat output from the Lums. However, this is not accounting for the pollination from the Mimikas. If we do that, then we actually only need 5.94 out of the 11 non-smoker critters to be Lums, and thus 5.06 of those critters can be Blums. Thus, our final ratio ends up at 6.94 Lums to 5.06 Blums, which is about 1.372 Lums per Blum. And thus, this column only ends up being about 40% taller than this column. And the ranch sizes are pretty similar. But overall, this illustrates that you generally want more Lums than Blums if you're doing this in a completely self-sustaining way. And if you want more peat for more power from the peat burners, or perhaps some more refined carbon production, you're going to want even more Lums than that. But yeah, Blums are so efficient at producing algae, you really don't need that many of them compared to the Lums. So all in all, we just end up with a really large amount of free resources. There's a little bit of work involved, but once you actually get the setup working for you, there's relatively little manual labor. There's just a little bit of duplicants grooming the Lums and the Blums. If you completely mechanize the delivery of the excess figs to the critter feeders, they don't even have to worry about that. And then they can just dedicate their time to cleaning out the smoker. But yeah, that's essentially that's everything that I wanted to talk about in this short little update video to our Lumb Ranch design. There's not overall a huge amount of changes. The automation layout is more or less the same as we had previously. We've tweaked the buffer gates and the critter sensors here to accommodate the Mimikas and their behavior. We've added this Visco Gel column. And again, you can just stack 4 liquids on top of each other at low mass if you don't have Visco Gel, but you can get Visco Gel on Relica pretty easily. So we've just used that. And then we managed to fit the Mimikas in here. We managed to fit the Lura Plants in here for a little bit of plastic production on the side. You can fit all of your peat burning buildings up here. And then with the Lums, with the Blum Lumbs over here, you can turn your excess water from the peat burning into more oxygen for your duplicants. And it's all very efficient and I love it. But yeah, thanks for watching. Let me know in the comments what your thoughts are on the November quality of life update with respect to Lums and Blums. It's been really fun saying Blums and Lums over and over again in this video. We spent a long time re-recording. I'll let you know that, so we can do it all seamlessly. But yes, if you like the video, let me know and like the video so that I can produce more content like this. Feel free to subscribe and you'll see lots more videos along these lines. We're going to do a lot more Sandbox Showcase videos talking about the rest of the Prehistoric Planet Pack content now that we managed to get that mod fixed again. And a lot of them will be live builds, but I hope you appreciate that we just skipped to the meat for this quick little update. And yeah, if you want to see this in action, we did more or less the same thing on Twitch in our previous Prehistoric Planet Pack run. And it worked really well, And the Blum Lumbs are so efficient at producing algae that we had so much food and oxygen that we didn't know what to do with it. We printed way more duplicants than we needed. Blum Lumbs are by far the most efficient source of oxygen in the game. And it's not even fair, it's more pay-to-win DLC content from play. But I don't have any problem with that. But I'll let Whiskers take us away, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye for now.
Whiskers sends thanks to the following Twitch subscribers and YouTube members: 999999999, Ayla Ivo, FRD. Lagbot 30,000, Neo Deus Machina, Quantum Zari, Stinger's Playground, Sweet Danger Kitty, Christian Nielsen 9363, Mark Miller 5161, and Xantiphon.